Hello everyone, welcome back to this new grammar lesson. Today we are going to learn all about verbs. First of all, what is a verb? Have a look at this sentence over here. A verb in English is generally an action word as it indicates action. So, what do I mean by verb? As it is describing an action, it is simply called an action word. Have a look at this example sentence. Emma eats a burger. In this sentence, the word eats refers to the verb because the word eats simply refers to the physical action, right? So here is the next example sentence. Rahim drives a car. Can you identify which is the verb? Absolutely, drives is the verb because driving is such a physical activity or process, right? I hope you would have understood what verb is. Do verbs indicate only actions? No, it also indicates state or being. What do you mean by state or being? State simply means situation or let's say condition. Here is the example sentence for you. I like coffee. In this sentence, like is a stative verb. Like is not an action verb. What is the reason? Because we are not talking about any physical activities. The word like just gives us information. So, therefore, it's a stative verb. One more example sentence for you. I understand the concept clearly. Again, we are not talking about any physical action. The word understand is a stative verb or we can call it a state verb. The word understand just gives us an information or condition. Here is the list of action verbs: cry, smile, run, drag, jump, kick, write, dance, walk, speak, drink, teach, etc. So these are all action verbs. Here is the list of state verbs. Action verbs are otherwise called as dynamic verbs. State verbs are also called as stative verbs. Agree, believe, doubt, guess, imagine, know, remember, suspect, think, understand, recognize, think, like, hate, dislike, want, prefer, love, appear, feel, etc. So these are all state verbs. What is the main difference between state verbs and action verbs? The difference is very simple. We can add ing forms only to the action verbs. I mean the continuous form, present continuous, past continuous, right? Future perfect continuous, something like that. But we should not add ing form in state verbs. If I say, I am understanding this grammar clearly, that's wrong. We should not add continuous form to the state verbs. Moving on to the next category of verbs, and that is main verbs. So let's understand what is meant by main verb. Main verbs have meaning on their own, unlike helping verbs. So let me tell you an example. So what am I doing right now? I teach grammar. So here the word teach is the main verb because it has meaning on their own. But if I say I am teaching grammar, am is the helping word over here and teaching is the main verb over here, right? So there are thousands of main verbs. You would have heard about V1, V2, V3, like the present tense, past tense, and past participle form of the verb. So main verbs can be divided into two categories. The first category is regular verbs. So what are regular verbs? The words that are ended with ed, they are all belong to the category of regular verbs. For example, talk, talked, talked, select, selected, selected, play, played, played, walk, walked, walked, live, lived, lived, things like that. And what are irregular verbs? Unlike regular verbs, words that are not ended with ed, they are all belong to the category of irregular verbs. Have a look at these words over here. Drive, drove, driven, cut, 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 choose, chose, chosen, write, wrote, written, fly, flew, flown, things like that. And moving on to the next category of verbs, and that is auxiliary verbs. So basically, auxiliary verbs can be divided into two types: primary auxiliary verbs, modal auxiliary verbs. First, we are talking about primary auxiliary verbs. So primary auxiliary verbs can be classified into three forms. So be form verbs, have form verbs, do form verbs. Now, what are be form verbs? Am, is, or was, were. So, they are all be form verbs, be verbs. So, these verbs are otherwise called as to be verbs. Next, have form verbs. There are three have form verbs in English: have, has, had. In a similar manner, do form verbs. How many do form verbs are there? Three do form verbs: do, does, did. So these are all primary auxiliary verbs: be form verbs, have form verbs, do form verbs. Now let's talk about modal auxiliary verbs: can, could, shall, should, will, would, may, might, must. So these are all modal auxiliary verbs. And what are semi-modals? Need, dare, used to, ought to. So these are all semi-modal auxiliary verbs. Moving on to the another category of verbs, and that is transitive verb. What is a transitive verb? A transitive verb is a verb that expresses an action with an object. For example, I am eating the watermelon. So I is the subject, I am eating is the verb, the watermelon is the object. How do I say the word watermelon is the object? Because an object answers the question what? I am eating what? The watermelon, right? So transitive verbs have an object. Intransitive verbs do not have an object. That's the difference. Simple, right? So what are intransitive verbs? Intransitive uh, verb is a verb that expresses an action without an object. For example, I am eating. So in this sentence, there is no object. So that's all about verbs. Let's recall quickly what is meant by verb. Verb simply means action words. Now, what is meant by action verbs? Action verbs, otherwise called as dynamic verbs. Now, verbs like cry, smile, weep, etc. So, these are all action verbs. We can add ing forms only in action verbs. And moving on to the next category of verbs, which is state verbs. State verbs are otherwise called as stative verbs. Now, words like, think, remember, forget. So these are all stative verbs. We should not add continuous form in stative verbs. And the next category is main verbs. V1, V2, V3, they all belong to the category of main verbs. Main verbs can be divided into two types: regular verbs and irregular verbs. Words that are ended with ed, for example, talk, talked, talked, they are all regular verbs. On the other hand, verbs that are not ended with ed, they are called as irregular verbs. For example, teach, taught, taught, think, thought, thought, begin, began, began, right? So moving on to the next category of verbs, and that is auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs are otherwise called as helping verbs. It can be classified into two types. The first category is primary auxiliary verb and the second category is modal auxiliary verbs. Let's now talk about primary auxiliary verbs. It has three forms. Primary auxiliary verbs have three forms. What are they? Be form verb, do form verb, have form verb. Now, what are be form verbs? Am, is, or, was, were. So these are otherwise called as to be verbs. Then have form verbs: have, has, had. Then next one is do form verbs: do, does, did, right? So these are all belong to the category of primary auxiliary verb. And the next category of the verb is modal auxiliary verbs. What is meant by modal auxiliary actually? It simply expresses the mood of the speaker. For example, can, could, shall, should, will, would, may, might, must. So these are all modal auxiliaries. And semi-modal auxiliary verbs like ought to, need to, dare. So these are all semi-modal auxiliary verbs, right? And the next category of verbs could be transitive verb. Transitive verbs have object. For example, I play cricket. Here cricket is the object. Intransitive verb, on the other hand, intransitive verb does not have an object. For example, I eat, right? So that's it about verbs. I hope you have understood all about verbs clearly, right? If you have any doubt, you could ask me in the comment sections. I'll be back with another new lesson. Until then, you stay motivated. Thank you.